What if there was a system that you could implement in any organization, and your vision, your dream, whatever it is, wherever you wanted your organization to go, it actually could come to fruition? What if there was such a system that actually existed? Hi, I'm Chris Comeaux. I'm the president and CEO of Teleios Collaborative Network, and I want to share with you what I really feel like has been my life's work. But first, I want to introduce you a little bit more to me. This is actually a picture of me. It's September 8th this past year. I got in an accident where I actually broke my neck. 4 days before, I actually did a 50-mile bike race. 4 days later, was just out for a bike ride Saturday afternoon, and actually broke my vertebrae in my neck. Fell off my bike. In fact, the two vertebrae that I broke are the same two that Christopher Reeves actually broke. So I'm pretty much a walking miracle, and asking myself the question, why am I still here? And I think part of the purpose of why I'm still here is due to this leadership system, this system that I've discovered through lots of reading, research, study, being out in the business world now for over 30 years, and seeing that most organizations do not have a system. But the power, if you actually have a leadership system, again, where your vision, your dream, your reality can actually come true. So, I have a question for you. What do you think is the most brilliant system in healthcare ever devised? Now, I'm pretty biased because I've actually grown up in hospice, and I actually think hospice is the answer to that question. And so when I say a system, I'm not quite sure what you actually think of, but hospice is a brilliant model, a brilliant system of healthcare. In fact, if you went to work as an employee for a hospice in North Carolina compared to a hospice in Montana, there's a system that exists there because the people that envisioned this model of care thought through the complete system. And so when I say a system, I think a lot of people are going, I don't know what you mean. Have you ever tried to do anything where you actually don't have a system? Think about a project that you might have on a Sunday afternoon at your home or at your house where you didn't have a system of how you're going to attack it. Not only would you not have a system, what if you didn't have tools? In fact, that's probably an even better metaphor to think about a leadership system. It is like a toolbox of tools, which is much different because when most people talk about leadership, it's a bunch of admonitions and theories, but no practical tools kind of to go around that. So, actually, I think, again, hospice is the most brilliant model of healthcare. In fact, I think hospice was my test network, where I've really been able to test this idea of a leadership system. You may go, what do you mean by a test network? And I got a funny story to tell you when I learned the power of a test network. My wife and I wanted to actually put an underground fence, a dog fence, at our home, which was about an acre at the time. And so I worked all day on this Saturday and buried this underground dog fence completely around our property. And buried the whole thing and got ready to plug it in. And guess what I realized? I hadn't actually checked the system. I buried the whole thing before I tested it. So I'm out there in our yard and I'm just cussing up a storm. And my wife comes out and says, what are you doing? What's wrong? I'm like, I'm an idiot. I buried this dog fence and I didn't test it ahead of time. And so now I don't know where there might be a cut in the line because I'm not sure why it's not working. She goes, oh, and she actually was an IT person by training. She says, why don't you set up a test network? I'm like, a test network? What do you mean? She said, just set up a small loop in the yard and you can test that the system actually works. I'm like going, oh, that's brilliant. So I set up the test network. I'm holding the prongs of the dog fence. Obviously was not very smart. She plugged it in and I got the shock of my life. In fact, I will tell you, I learned the lesson of a test network and I will never forget it the rest of my life. So a test network is obviously almost like a small experiment where you can test something that you have a theory that will actually work on a much broader scale. In fact, the hospice in Henderson County, North Carolina, called Four Seasons, became my test network. In fact, I've got this picture here of Little Hospice on the Prairie, because when I started at Four Seasons back in 2002, it was just a small program, about 25 employees. We were caring for about 30 or 35 patients. We grew incredibly, just very rapid pace. And over about a 2 or 3 year period, we grew to an organization of over 150 people, serving over 200 patients a day. And I'll never forget, we were at the staff meeting, because if I'm honest with you, I was making it up as I would go along. I didn't really know what I was doing. And we were actually in a staff meeting, and one of our nurse practitioners, her name was Dee. Dee said, do you guys even know what you're doing? Isn't there a book that you can read somewhere? And I remember walking away from that meeting going, God, I wish she was right. I wish there actually was a book that you can read that would be a system by which we can take this incredible growth, and we had this beautiful vision for our organization, But there wasn't one book that would be a leadership system that would help us navigate what we were actually going through. In fact, that's kind of my hypothesis. Could you imagine there was a leadership system? I mean, there's so many businesses that fail within our economy because people have a good idea, but they actually don't know, how do we actually execute? How do we take this dream and create a plan and actually train our leaders and our staff on how to execute that plan on a day-to-day basis? Can you imagine if the confluence of capital, competent leaders, a business idea, and a leadership system that can make it come to fruition? Well, that's my hypothesis. In fact, Four Seasons won the Circle of Life Award in 2009, and they actually cited it for three things. They said our palliative care program was one of the tops in the nation, and we were actually doing research. We were contributing to the evidence-based medicine of end-of-life care, which very few people were doing. But the third thing they cited in that Circle of Life Award was huge music to my ears because it was my hypothesis being proven. And that citing was this. They said your leadership system makes it so within the organization that you can plant any strategy and would actually come to fruition. That was our hypothesis. That's what we were actually trying to prove. And this Circle of Life Award was affirmation that we were actually onto something. In fact, where I originally kind of got the idea of this is I worked for a national company called the Studer Group, which is now part of Huron. And Studer was known for a system by which you would improve patient satisfaction within your hospital. But what I also start to see that there was a broader need, not just a system to improve patient satisfaction, because that's one strategy, but what if there was a system that existed for your broad strategic plan, even to help you develop that strategic plan, all the way down to training your leaders to execute it on a day-to-day basis. That is what I believe a leadership system is. So I left Studer, went back to Four Seasons in 2008, and it's where I actually made it my learning laboratory to prove, is this hypothesis provable? And again, when Four Seasons won the Circle of Life Award in 2009, it felt like we really were onto something. So today, I'm the CEO of Teleios Collaborative Network. It's a network of 8 hospices in 4 different states. And each of these hospices stays separate. They're different organizations, but yet they're part of this family of organizations. That's why the name is Teleios Collaborative Network. And you may think, well, are you just on paper, just different organizations just coming together for certain purposes? That the leadership system is our secret sauce. The leadership system helps us operate as we are one big organization, but yet it allows each organization independently within its market to set strategy and intention within that market and actually execute that strategy. So the leadership system is really our secret sauce in the work that we're actually doing. Now, you may go, okay, well, you've talked about this leadership system, but what is it actually made up of? There are really 3 different components. The first component is the foundation of what is this thing that called leadership. If you did a Google, you'd actually get 750 million hits in a second of leadership if you just Googled that word. So there are all these different definitions. In fact, there was a guy who did a lot of work around leadership, a guy named Elliot Jacques. And what Elliot said is if you got 2 scientists together and you talked about an erg, they would actually have a common definition of what an erg is because there's a common lexicon around scientific language. But if you get 2 consultants that sit around a table and talk about things around leadership, they're all over the map because they think they're talking about the same thing, but they're not. So the first thing we do is establish a foundation of what is this thing leadership, so a lexicon around it. But then we have an operating system and software. Now I don't mean an actual computer, but it's a great metaphor because think about it. If I grabbed your computer right now, I can work it. Either you've got probably a Windows or a Mac operating system, and both of which most people have actually seen. Without that operating system, you cannot actually use that computer. But think about, with a computer having operating system and software, you can actually do work every day. You can create. You can take an idea and actually bring it to fruition. Well, that's a great metaphor of what a leadership system does for an organization. You can actually take a vision and strategy, and it actually comes to fruition in your organization. So, first portion again is that foundation. What is leadership? And so there are a couple of things that are part of the foundation. We call it the 4 primary ongoing tasks of a leader. What is a common definition of leadership? Also, what is a common definition of followership? And we also have a whole lexicon around something called core stratagems. It comes from one of the greatest thought leaders in leadership, Dr. Lee Thayer. So we use all of that to actually set the foundation. And then, as I said, we have the operating system. So now the operating system. We talked about the foundation. Now the operating system. So the operating system starts with how do we develop a plan? How do we actually scan the external environment? What's going on externally? And then based upon what's going on externally, how do we actually make a map or a plan of how we're going to navigate that? And so how do you develop a 10-year and 3-year plan? But then how do you eat the elephant? You remember the adage, just you eat the elephant one bite at a time. So how do you take that long-term plan and break it down into a 1-year operational plan? And then how do you even break it down even further to break it down into quarterly big rocks? So that way your team can know on a quarterly basis, because it is really difficult to constantly look out 10 years ahead and then bring it back down to what you focus on a day-to-day basis. But people can do that in 90-day chunks. So how do you break that down into a 90-day plan? And some of you are thinking, well, you can't predict the future. Well, guess what? We actually have some tools that challenge you. We call them the prow of the ship questions. How do you actually stand on the prow of the ship and answer some of these questions that help you as much as possible be proactive as an organization? But then there's stuff that's going to happen that we didn't anticipate. Guess what? We've got tools in the leadership system related to that as well. It's called an issues list. How do you deal with the issues that we didn't expect? How do you actually name them and actually solve for those problems? And then, of course, any system would just be a system unless you had people to operate the system. So how do you get the right people in the bus, get them in the right seat, and actually help compose them in such a way that they truly work together as a team? And how do they become fully competent to perform their roles? All of those tools are actually part of the operating system. Then the next thing you have is the actual software. So the software is how you then operate the system on a day-to-day basis. So things like, how do you have effective meetings? That's where a lot of the work actually occurs of executing the plan. And so training your leaders on how to have an effective meeting. Training your leaders on how they organize themselves on a day-to-day basis. So they choose the right priorities, those priorities that you set with intention when you did all of that strategic planning. Even helping them, how do they navigate email? Because quite often you can have all this great intention, and then they get on email and they're off in a totally different direction than where you actually wanted them to go as an organization. How do you help them work better as a team? Understanding themselves, having self-awareness, understanding their coworkers, and then developing to grow and learn over the course of time to be better communicators and team members with each other. All of that is part of the system. How do you create a culture of service? Quite often when people grow as an organization, they say, oh, it's not like it used to be. And then they think that they form an opinion that, oh, growth is then a bad thing, and we were much more service-friendly when we were smaller. It doesn't have to be that way. There are tools that you can have in your system that pervades a culture of service as you continue to grow and bring more and more people within your organization. Then how do you teach your organization how to take data and make good decisions? Our joke is that you don't have to have an MBA to actually understand numbers. So the last thing I'll leave you with is there's a wonderful metaphor I learned years ago, and it was a guy talking about leadership, and he kept using this analogy, called it the vision of the eagle. Now, I don't know if you know this, I didn't when I heard it, but when an eagle actually flies, it sees the horizon and looks down for its food at the same time. Any great system has to have both axes within their system. One where you're constantly looking out from a vision standpoint, but making it happen on a day-to-day basis. Both together are leadership, looking at the horizon and absolutely executing it. And the leadership system that we espouse actually has tools on both sides. So this is Chris Comeaux again, the CEO of Teleios Collaborative Network. Thank you for your time and attention.